Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the forum. It's so good to see you all today. I'm so glad you're able to be here for the forum. As I often say, every year we choose a theme. Our theme this year is bridges. And I've been thinking a lot about the bridges theme just with the coronaviruses, kind of building up walls and wondering how we can continue to reach out and build bridges even despite the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Today's guest is a person who's dedicated a portion of his life to building a bridge to the past, to understanding the 800-year-old philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is the one who said that youth is the cause of hope, namely because the object of hope is future, is difficult, and is possible. Matthew Fox is a spiritual theologian, an Episcopal priest, and an activist for gender justice and eco-justice. He's written 37 books that have been translated into other languages over 70 times. Among them are The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, A Spirituality Named Compassion, The Pope's War, and most recently, The Tao of Thomas Aquinas, Fierce Wisdom for Hard Times. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Fox. This morning, I went about all my bookshelves, taking down your books and Thomas Aquinas' books, and it was a stack like this. And I was going to bring them all down. I thought, I don't think we're going to need to look up anything in the Summa today. But I hope I was wrong about that.
Well, I enjoyed reading your book too on Thoreau.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
A couple years ago.
That's very kind of you.
Real important book. Yeah.
When I see you as an adult, and as I've been following you during these last 30, 40 years. You have a very youthful style and presence. No matter how much older you get, you still have that a kind of playfulness in you. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just what you remember about playing as a child. When you were a child, what did you play at, and what are your recollections of that time?
Well, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, which is, of course, a university town and also a capital city. And there's a lot of nature there. So there are 4 lakes within the boundaries of the city. And of course, we did a lot of playing. Of course, that was before global warming, so we had real winters in Wisconsin.
Right.
I remember one winter, the snow was so high, we had to go out the second floor window. That left an impression on me.
That would.
I was probably about 5 or so. But I grew up with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, so it was a big family. And we played a lot, and the door was always open, back in those days. And there were a lot of games. I was in the middle of the family, the neurotic middle, number 4. Yeah. So my older brothers and sister would have all these games and get all the neighborhood kids. And anyway, and of course there wasn't TV. In fact, when we finally got a TV, we were the last family on the block to have a TV. My mother was anti-TV. She said it would interfere with reading, and she felt reading was really important.
I guess she was right.
And she was right. When we did get it, we'd put it in the basement.
Oh, yeah.
So you have a real excuse to go watch TV in our house. But so we played. You played at night and everything. And so anyway, there was a lot of play in my upbringing, I think, and in nature especially. Yeah. But I guess it's just part of, it's one of the things Aquinas says. There's a chapter in this book, and he emphasizes how playing is a virtue, and fun is a virtue. And he says people who can't play are ungrateful boors.
Yes.
And no one wants them around anyway. They're no fun to be around.
So how does play fit into the rest of his thought? I mean, why is play something that he mentions, and why is play important to Aquinas?
Well, I think, and I know it's true to me, I think that playing with ideas is so important.
Yeah.
There's a big difference, unfortunately, between academia and intellectual life.
Yeah.
A lot of academia has lost its sense of play. And of course, part of that is the capitalist underpinnings. You always have to prove something. You always have to, and the Calvinist underpinnings. You have to prove your salvation or something. But Aquinas, I would certainly say that an intellectual life is about playing with ideas. And this can be very serious play. But that whole imagination, the dimension of imagination is so important. And again, Aquinas says, the same spirit that hovered over the waters at the beginning of creation we'd say today, hovered over the fireball at the beginning of creation,
Yeah.
is alive in the mind of the artist at work. So in other words, the Holy Spirit that launched everything is alive and well as we work and as we give birth and as we create, and all this is play. Jung said there's no creativity without play and fantasy.
Right.
So a culture that does not repress creativity but encourages it has to be encouraging play.
Yeah, I think it's connected to the Sabbath. I mean, the Sabbath kind of creates a space in our life.
Absolutely, well said. You're right. The Sabbath is about play, and as you know, in the Jewish tradition, unfortunately, it hasn't crept into the Christian tradition awfully well. The Sabbath is supposed to do two things on the Sabbath. One is to read the Song of Songs, and the other is to make love.
Yeah.
So that making love is a spiritual act of play in the biblical tradition, in Jesus' tradition, not in the Augustinian tradition.
Oh, I can't wait to share that news with my wife.
Definitely.
I've had a measurable impact already.
Rabbi Heschel's daughter, Susanna Heschel, who's a
yeah.
feminist theologian,
Yeah.
she tells a story how every Saturday she and the kids had to be quiet between 1 and 4 because her parents retired to the bedroom and they wanted quiet, So she tells a very subtle story about how literal Rabbi Heschel and his wife were about celebrating the Sabbath.
I was so glad to see how many times Rabbi Heschel's words appeared in your book. I think he's a 20th century figure we don't hear enough from in the 21st century.
Well, I couldn't agree more. To me, he's one of the greatest figures, spiritual, theological figures of the 20th century. I've often said if I was alone on a desert island, I'd want 2 theologians with me or their works, Howard Thurman and Rabbi Heschel.
Yeah, wow.
Now, my closest friends, Aquinas and Eckhart, they're already in me, so I don't need their books.
Yes, right.
But these two, because I'm always learning from them, and Heschel is stunning. Of course, one reason I love Heschel is that he's the kind of person who taught Jesus.
Right,
because Jesus was a Jew and not a Christian. And so he didn't begin with the baggage of dualism and Platonism that so much of Christian theology has begun with. And that's one of the things you see I love about Aquinas. He stood up to Plato and Neoplatonism, which means he stood up to the entire patristic tradition in choosing Aristotle. Aristotle was a complete, radical revolutionary who was brought into Europe only in the early 13th century by way of Muslim translators. So he had 3 strikes against him. 1, he was pagan. 2, he was a scientist. And 3, he came through Islam.
Yeah.
But Aquinas just latched on to him at the age of 17 or so. And his whole life was about bringing Aristotle in. And he says, why? Because he's non-dualist, because he does not denigrate matter, he says. And so this set Aquinas off from hundreds of years of theology.
Yeah.
And it got him in trouble, as I point out, that he was condemned 3 times after he died by bishops in Oxford and Paris before they canonized him saint.
Canterbury, yeah.
Yeah, Canterbury, that's right.
Right. No, but you're so right, and you're right. I can't imagine Aquinas without that influence. It's maybe the most influential person on his thought. It's an interesting thing to think of, just like structuring his thought in that kind of way.
And his courage.
And his courage.
See, and that's where he's not just an intellectual. He's really prophetic, and he writes profoundly about being prophetic and how we're all called to moral outrage, but steering it in a good direction.
Yeah.
But he loves anger. He says,
I know he does.
Just so the person's angry at the right people for the right reasons, expresses it in the appropriate manner and for the appropriate length of time.
Yeah.
So the whole thing about changing society out of moral outrage is right up his alley.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too, because I think of also you as a young person. I mean, you basically had to make some early decisions in terms of your religious vocation that really set you on a different path, and those were very courageous decisions. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that stage of your life and how you made those decisions. It would have been very easy, I think, to have a more conventional life, and yet you chose not to.
Well, I went to a public high school, Madison West, and my best friends were agnostic or Jewish or Protestant. I was Roman Catholic. And so we had these great philosophical debates, and I'd go back to my parish priest, who was a Dominican, and he would feed me G.K. Chesterton and Aquinas and things. So it started, and then because I was living in a university town and my father was connected to the university, the intellectual life meant a lot to me, even as a teenager. And so that's why I was drawn to the Dominicans, because I realized they had an intellectual tradition that included Aquinas. The Dominicans never mentioned Meister Eckhart. I had to find him years after I graduated from the seminary. But that tradition is there, and that meant a lot to me. So I joined the Dominicans a couple years after high school, and I thought I'd give it a try. And it worked for 34 years.
I know, exactly. It's a long time.
And it's a long time. In fact, I made the discovery.
I love that. You're longer than...
I made the discovery. Aquinas was only a Dominican for 30 years because he died at 49. I was Dominican for 34. That's when they kicked me out. Well, it wasn't really them. It was the Pope who kicked me out.
Yeah. So how did that happen? I mean, that was one of the questions that somebody asked me this week when I was describing your thought.
Well, the right wing in America got all riled up because I supported the Catholic gay group, Dignity.
Dignity.
They had a big
integrity.
conference in Seattle, hundreds of people, and they invited me to come and speak, which I did. And afterwards, the right wing in Seattle, that was very strong, called CUF, they sent documents to Rome saying this guy's naughty, and then Rome started an investigation of my books. Up to then, they took 3 of my books, and the Dominicans in Chicago province where I'm from, they set up a commission of 3 theologians, and they took like 2 years, took their time, and they sent back a letters to Rome saying that guy's
it's okay.
within the tradition.
Yeah.
6 months later, Rome sent a letter back, said, do it again. No, he's not, and all this stuff. He's a heretic. And they said, no, we won't. So there was a standoff for years, and the Dominicans in Chicago were supporting me.
Yeah.
But then the pressure just got too much. I mean, Rome knows how to, put pressure on. And they started to cave. And then the Dutch Dominicans said, we'll give you religious asylum, they said. You can join our province. We've been protecting theologians for 700 years. We know how to do it. They said that the Americans don't know how to do it. They've never had a real theologian, is what they said. So they sent a formal letter from the provincial council to my provincial saying, we will adopt Matthew, and he can continue his work in California. And I said, perfect, we got a solution.
Right.
But my provincial, I remember the moment, he pounded his fist on the table. He's about 15 years younger than I. And he said, I don't want you in any order in the world. And in any province in the world.
Yeah.
So that was my goose was cooked, because the rules are you have to get permission from your previous province to join a new province.
Right.
So that's when I got booted. And that's when the Episcopal Church welcomed me. Bishop Swing welcomed me, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
In fact, it was right in this space that we had the planetary mass. We brought
I
over.
wanted to ask you about that. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about the beginning of those planetary masses and just kind of like what the future is for those.
Well, I wrote my book right around that time called The Reinvention of Work, which was well-timed. I didn't know I'd be looking for work after 34 years. And the last chapter was on reinventing ritual. And 2 weeks after I handed the book in to Harper here, this group from Sheffield, England, of young 20-somethings in the Anglican Church came to see me at a conference in Seattle. And they told me about what they call the planetary mass, how they had brought rave into the mass.
Yeah, right.
And so I went to check it out, went to Sheffield. I was really impressed. How can I help you guys? Well, they said, if you became an Episcopal priest, that would be great. You could run interference.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'll think it over. So I did, and I prayed about it. And then I went to Bishop Swing here and told him I wanted to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship. And he said, go for it. So then I got Anita Roddick to put up money to bring 35 of these young people here to this space, the basement.
Yeah.
And they put on what they called the planetary mass. And Jerry Garcia was there, I remember, and some others. And it made the front page of the Chronicle, I think.
Yeah.
And then...
And
Yeah.
maybe you could describe what it was like. I mean, for people who weren't there.
Well, we've done over 100 masses now. We call
Yeah.
it the Cosmic Mass.
Cosmic
We
Mass,
did
yeah.
one here a couple years ago upstairs. And we did one at the National Cathedral 2
Yeah,
years
yeah.
ago. And we chose the theme of racism and healing, which was pretty edgy in Washington, D.C., and it worked well. We did one at the World Parliament of Religions last November in Toronto, and it was very well received.
Yeah.
500 people came, including Buddhist monks and everybody. And many people said it was a high point of the entire 10-day conference for them. So I just think it's important to bring postmodern art forms,
Yeah.
language, into worship. And just I think of the 12th century, the the Gothic cathedral and the stained glass. It was an absolute revolution.
Yeah.
But so is the electronic movement. So having DJs and VJs and rap and all that, these are postmodern art forms. Why shouldn't they be welcomed in worship?
Yeah.
And so every time we've done one rather recently in San Antonio, actually in a Catholic seminary. And we didn't tell the bishop, and the seminary didn't sponsor, but they allowed us in, you see, in their space.
Right.
And a lot of the priests there came, and then they got kind of spanked when the
I'm
Pope,
sorry to hear that.
the bishop heard about it.
Yeah.
I'm not sorry to hear about it.
Yeah,
But
we'll get the
people
spanking
should get
part.
in trouble.
So what advice do you have for the Roman Catholic Church? And like, I mean, just for like ordinary people, and then just like the hierarchy too. You understand that world, and you have a vision. What would you say?
Well, when
that-
Pope Francis came in, I wrote him a series of letters, a short book called Letters to Pope Francis,
Yeah.
giving him my advice,
Yeah.
what he should do.
Yeah, good.
And one thing I said is that they should stop talking about sexuality for about 15 years and start talking about other things. And also welcome science again, etc.
Yeah.
And I've been getting letters from all over the years saying, "Oh, look, he's doing what you told him. Look, he's doing this." And his encyclical Laudate Si, which is really
Right.
a
Oh, it
major
is.
work
It's a
and a
major
good work.
Yeah.
It was actually written 80% of it by one of my students.
Oh yeah.
So I like to tell people that two popes called my work dangerous and deviant over a 34-year period. And then this pope is plagiarizing it. So I've lived a full circle.
That is the.
But I think the church has to die in its present form. You asked me what it does, and I think it is. I don't think I think it has to die in its present form. There's a lot of treasures there, but we have to recycle them, and we have to sort out the gross and the dross, and the wheat from the chaff. And I think it's happening. I mean, the number of young people who are not signing up, if you will. So I think we have to put spirituality first, which is really an effort to precise what the real message and practice of Jesus is.
Yeah.
And I think all the churches, I mean, it's not just the Catholic Church that's losing numbers, but they're all overgrown, kind of, and we have to get down to the essence. And that's what I love about this book, frankly, that Aquinas, I pull out 30, each chapter is a sentence from Aquinas. The title is 31 of them. And each sentence, I think, just really gets into the heart of the matter of
What's
what
your
Christianity
favorite
is
sentence
about.
of
these
them all?
31?
Yeah.
Oh,
Or what's the
I
one
was
that's
looking them
occurring to
over
you?
before this morning.
It's good to like.
Every one turns me on.
I know.
But I was excited that you opened this morning quoting from the very first one.
Yeah.
The first sentence is, "The experience of God should not be restricted to the few or to the old."
Yeah.
And within that chapter, then, I talk about what Aquinas says about the young. And you caught it exactly, those three things. That the young, they aren't deterred by big projects. They have lots of hope in them. And there's lots of enthusiasm. He even says the enthusiasm of the young is paralleled by drunken people.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I really like that. That the young still know how to get high and have visions. And of course, that's Pentecost. That's Joel, the prophet Joel, that the young shall have visions and the old shall dream dreams. So to bring the young and old together, the intergenerational wisdom is so important today. But I mean, I went through that list this morning, and I couldn't say what was my favorite. I love them all.
Funny. Yeah.
Here's a good one. It became the title of my book on
Oh yeah, right.
on evil. Aquinas says, of the Spirit are far more grave than sins of the flesh.
Yeah.
Sins of the flesh take you toward God, and sins of the Spirit take you away from God. Now, sins of the Spirit are things like greed and envy and violence and so forth. But I would love for you as a rector here to preach on that one
I
sentence
think about
sometime.
that all the time. I totally agree.
Do
with
that,
you.
yeah.
Well, that's the tradition. The tradition says that pride is far more serious a sin than
Right,
the Ten
right,
Commandments.
right. Although I'd prefer the word arrogance to
Yeah,
pride. I
yeah.
think pride
Well,
isn't
pride
a sin.
we get confused about what.
Yeah,
pride means.
arrogance. But
The
I couldn't agree
theological
more. And of course, that
meaning.
would include racism and
Yeah,
sexism
completely.
and homophobia. Those are sins of arrogance.
Right, exactly. And those are spiritual sins.
Yeah, and Aquinas kind of elaborates, and he says, sins of the flesh take you toward God because it is always a quest for communion,
Yeah.
a quest for union.
Yeah.
So I mean, just that alone just turns a lot of, what should I say, theological preaching inside out over centuries.
Definitely does.
So he has so many, and then that one really strikes me too. He says, Aquinas was an absolute genius. I mean, he was a freak. He had a photographic memory. He memorized the Bible like that. He was an Einstein of his day, and yet he says that let me just get this right. Yeah, he says the greatest thing the human mind can know is that it does not know God.
Right.
Whoa! And here we go around stomping at every dollar bill and coin and MX missile and God we trust. Yeah. That reverence for and respect for the mystery of divinity.
Right.
Even though we can know a lot, and he keeps saying it's through creation especially that we meditate on God.
Well, the definition of God is incomprehensible to us. If God is God, then there's no way we're going to. I had someone I was at a supper on Thursday night, and the person asked me about the challenge of suffering, and that's what I talked about is just the unknowability of God. But what would you say to somebody who sees so much suffering in the world and is so sensitive to it, and it causes them to feel a sense of doubt about God?
Well, that God participates in the suffering.
Yeah, that's
and
what I
if
said too.
that's not what the cross is about, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But of course, the Holocaust raised that question profoundly, in the Jewish tradition especially. And again, like Elie Wiesel says, well, God was the person being hung from a tree and so forth. So I think that's what incarnation means, that divinity participates. And it's not just humans who suffer. And again, I think we have to take the bigger picture. And the Buddhists are good at this, that all beings suffer.
Yeah.
And all beings undergo, now we know that even stars and supernovas and galaxies undergo life, death, and resurrection.
Yeah.
And the Paschal mystery is a cosmic habit, not just an individual thing with Jesus. So, it's part of being here that obviously life contains its suffering.
Yeah.
But the joy is greater. Rabbi Zalman Schachtner used to say, there's more good than evil in the world, but not by much.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very Jewish and very practical and realistic. So you have to work at the good part.
Right.
And Aquinas is so good at that. I mean, he's always talking about goodness. In fact, he has the phrase original goodness. And I got condemned for my phrase original blessing, which is the same thing. And by the way, that's the book that freaked out Rome the most, because they're really invested in original sin.
Yeah.
And which is a shame because Jesus was not. Jesus never heard of it. So I don't understand why Western religion has followed Augustine more than has followed Jesus. Because Augustine was the first to use original sin. So that phrase, original goodness, is everywhere in Aquinas. He's always talking about goodness. But you have to be looking for it, And Aquinas was an optimist. And he was living at an optimistic time. The Renaissance of the 12th century, he had launched a whole new sense of education and spiritual movements, including the Franciscans and Dominicans and others. But you have to look for goodness. Like Meister Eckhart, who really stands on Aquinas' shoulders. Without Aquinas, there would be no Meister Eckhart. But Eckhart says, who is a good person? a good person praises good people. Well, notice what that means. It means that you're hunting, gathering for good people. And you have to make an effort.
Right.
And, our media is often so drawn to selling itself, making money, that it falls short about the pursuit of goodness. It really is like, well, in fact, upstairs, a year or two ago, I interviewed Lorna Byrne, this
Right. You mentioned
this Irish woman
exactly.
who's had experiences of angels since she was 2 years old. And one question I asked her was about, well, what about evil angels? Oh, she said, evil gets all the headlines. I will not give them any more headlines. I do not talk about evil angels.
That's great.
Isn't that
I
interesting?
love it. It's so interesting.
But she's a peasant woman. She's illiterate.
Yeah.
She's illiterate. And yet she sees all the headlines are about evil. And it's true, evil sells, cars that crash and things that burn.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean we want to be misinformed about bad things, but we have to fill our souls up with goodness, because that's how you go through life with joy. And so the joy is bigger. I see it as like a wreath that embraces even the evil, even the suffering.
Yeah, I feel that way very strongly. I mean, this is the heart of the way I look at the world.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about just things that in Aquinas that you feel like don't translate very well into the 21st century, and then things that in Aquinas that you might disagree with, too. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Pardon me. Well, in my big book on Aquinas called Sheer Joy, again, the title comes from him. He says, sheer joy is God's, and this demands companionship. So for him, the whole universe exists because of the joy of God and the joy that we are here to participate in. But in that book, I have a long introduction, whereas this book is much, much shorter. And there I talk about the clay feet of Aquinas.
Right, exactly.
And I think we do have to always examine the clay feet of our saints. Because for one thing, how else could we identify with them? And but everyone has clay feet. It's part of being human, to have a shadow. And one of the shadows I note for Aquinas is that he borrowed Aristotle's teaching on women. And yet he didn't go along with all of it. He talks, for example, about how marriage is a relationship of equals. The friendship in marriage is a friendship of man and woman who are equals. And I
Which
think
is an amazing thing from the medieval period,
It is. It is. Because Augustine had said, and I quote, man but not women is made in the image and likeness of God.
Isn't that terrible? There's so many
Aquinas
things
says man and women are made in the image and likeness of God. But furthermore, Aquinas is a proto-feminist, that's what I call him, because he's non-dualistic. And Rosemary Ruther, the feminist theologian, says that's the essence of feminism, is non-dualism. And that's why Aquinas chose Aristotle over Plato, and he tells us, because there's this non-dualism. And for example, Augustine defines spirit as whatever is not matter. What? You can't get more dualistic than that. Aquinas throws that out. It says spirit is the elan, the vitality in everything. In a blade of grass, in a tree, in a horse, in an idea. All that is creativity. All that is spirit at work. So, and another neat teaching from Aquinas, I've not seen it elsewhere, maybe you have. He said about resurrection. He says there are two resurrections. The first is waking up in this lifetime. Once you've done that, you don't have to worry about the second. That's really interesting. He's just shifted the whole thing about the quest for immortality and is my ego going to live forever or won't it? And let me build these many towers with my name on it so I'll live forever, or pyramids, live forever. Aquinas throws all that out and says the first meaning of resurrection is to wake up. And I think that's really something we want to recover, especially in the approach to Easter.
Right. Yeah, it's funny because in a way there's parts of your book which are lessons we can learn from Aquinas just in our interpersonal relationships, and then lessons that are kind of more social in nature. And you mentioned the anger one earlier, and I thought that was interesting that that was something that you focused in on in terms of Aquinas' teaching. But maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, because it's part of the prophetic. Aquinas writes a lot about the prophetic, and it's really solid stuff. It's the kind of stuff you read in Rabbi Heschel's classic work on the prophet. And he talks about it. Prophets are angry, they're morally outraged, and they appeal to the imagination. So they use art and symbols and metaphors as their weapons, if you will.
Right.
But Aquinas is also hugely big on the cosmos. There's a wonderful sentence. He says, he takes the line from the psalmist who says, they should get drunk on the plenty of thy house. And Aquinas says, they should get drunk on the plenty of thy house, that is the universe. That we're here to get drunk on the universe. And Aquinas says, the greatest thing about the human person is this, that we are capable of understanding the cosmos. And he says, Revelation comes in 2 volumes, nature and the Bible. So he absolutely resists the fundamentalist notion that the Bible book is the only Bible, or that it's the holy book. No, nature is a holy book, and that's why he is so eager to listen to science. Yeah. He says a mistake about creation results in a mistake about God. Now, a perfect example of that, and you asked what would be a clay feet of Aquinas, would be the issue of homosexuality today. It was settled by science in the 1970s that a certain percentage of human beings are going to be gay or lesbian, and that's how it is, roughly 8%. So it's science. It's a Copernicus struggle of today.
Right.
That it's like religion. A lot of religion has not learned the lesson from the Galileo case, that religion thought it knew more than science about the universe. Now we think, some religious people think they know more about science than psychologists do about the nature of a sexual minority. And so I think Aquinas would, of course, have flipped entirely on this because he listens to science where he's living today. Whereas he went along with the homophobia of his time, that it was, quote, unnatural. Now we've counted 464 other species with gay and lesbian populations. So it's not unnatural.
Right.
It would be unnatural to a heterosexual, but it's not unnatural for a homosexual or a bisexual.
Yeah.
So his love of science and his insistence that we develop, this is pre-modern thinking.
Yeah.
This is not just Aquinas, it's indigenous thinking too. You begin with the cosmos, not with the human. That's what the modern age did, and that was a big mistake, that we begin with the human. And so we begin so easily with sin. Only humans sin. Why begin with sin? Yeah. Begin with the universe. Even the Bible, Genesis, doesn't begin with sin. It doesn't begin with humans. Humans are latecomers. We're the last. Yeah. Which is evolution's story too.
Yeah, that's one of your big points too. Is just that the universe should be our point of focus, not the individual human being. But
Aquinas says that time and again. And when he's talking about evil, he says that. He says, for a lion killing the lamb is hard on the lamb, but it's real good for the lion.
Yeah.
And so you got to kind of step back and see the big picture.
Right.
Lambs go on, the sheep species goes on, and the lion species goes on.
Yeah.
And you get the bigger picture. So what's evil to one may not be evil to the other. And he said the same holds for human beings. He says we step back and see the bigger picture, and our own suffering finds a context.
Yeah, and I think so much about climate change and what a pressing issue it is for us. And I wonder what resources you see in Aquinas that help us to conceptualize that in a different way.
Well, first of all, I just love this one. He says, redemption first and primarily means this, to preserve things in the good. Yeah. And he uses that sentence numerous times in his writings. Notice, he's not talking about heaven, he's not talking about hell, to preserve things in the good. We're back to that goodness theme again.
Created good.
That's the meaning of salvation and redemption. So that's what it means to save the earth, folks, to change our lifestyles so that we're preserving things in the good for future generations, not just of humans, but of all the beings on the earth. And of course, he says that every creature is a word of God, another logos, another Christ. Yes, another Christ. And we have no right to be extinguishing species hand over fist like we're doing today. So I wrote a whole article on that. I published it in my book on Wrestling with the Prophets called Aquinas as an Environmental Prophet.
Yeah.
Because so many of his teachings line up along that way, but especially just that one alone. To take away, again, the anthropocentric version of redemption to something more real that is about preserving things in the good. And of course, preserving doesn't mean freezing. It means that we join the forces of evolution, the rhythms of evolution, including our own as a species, and bring everything to the table to assure that the future will be healthy and beautiful for others.
Yeah. You know, one of the words that comes up a lot in the book is joy.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's just like a central part of your understanding of God and faith and the world. And what does Aquinas say about joy?
Oh, so much. It's the via positiva, of course, of the mystics. He says, joy is a human's noblest act. Joy is a human's noblest act. What an invitation. What if we should sit down and start designing, playing with, what would a civilization be like that agreed on that one sentence, that joy is a human's noblest act? What would it do to education? What would it do to religion? What would it do to politics and economics and the media? To put joy forward, to make this a commitment, to bring the joy of our species out. And again, this parallels what he's saying about divinity, that joy is sheer joy is God's, and this demands companionship. So God is delighted with our joy.
Right.
But joy and justice for Aquinas go together. That's justice is a struggle to make joy more possible for more people and more beings in an eco-justice consciousness. And the truth is, my impression of most beings, most animals, is, and birds, I mean, they're singing a lot. They must be kind of joyful. I think most beings are not counting their wounds and suffering and blaming it on original sin or something. I think they're here to be joyful. I know my dog is.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I was surfing with two dolphins this week. They just seemed so happy.
Surfing with two dolphins, how exotic.
And the dolphins came along. But they were like so close together, just like in such a beautiful alignment. And I mean, basically they were surfing the undersides of the waves.
Wow.
I mean, they were rejoicing.
That's
that's
great. Well, I'm glad to hear that both they and you were rejoicing. Yeah, joy is everything for Aquinas.
Yeah. One of our biggest problems in America, I think, it just is racism. And I wonder what resources for addressing racism in America you see in Aquinas, or is it not helpful in that department?
No, it certainly is. Even his understanding of the prophetic, you see, as interfering with injustice. And being angry, tap into your moral outrage about it and do something creative about it. No, his teachings, I think, really feed an authentically democratic view of the world. Yeah. And even the very first one, the one about the experience of God, is not restricted to the few or to the old, or, if you will, to the powerful or the less powerful.
Right.
And that we're all empowered by the Holy Spirit. And he says that leadership is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and it's there for all of us to participate in. So absolutely, he would name racism, were he alive today, certainly, as one of these sins against the Holy Spirit, and a sin of arrogance, that one race thinks is superior to another, or one gender, etc. I think he would be part of all these movements today in recognizing, as he says, God is justice. And the quest for justice is a quest for God. In fact, there's a wonderful line here that is the title of one of the chapters where he says, the proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. The proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. Well, you'd think that would be in mind or something, but no, the heart. And in this, he's very Jewish, because it's true. The Jewish people put the intellect not in the brain, but in the heart. And that's where Aquinas is, too. But then he has another chapter called The Vision of God is Arrived at Through Justice. I just love that. That is so celebrating the via transformativa. That it's not just a moral thing to work for justice. It's a vision of God. When you're on the front lines for justice, when you're resisting racism or sexism or economic oppression or the rest, or eco-oppression, that itself is a vision of God.
Yeah.
All our visions of God are not about sitting in sweet contemplative places. They also happen when you're on the front lines, when you're in a struggle, when you go to jail. In fact, I point out, this book is primarily, I wrote it for activists. I call it a handbook for a spiritual handbook for activists that you can take to jail with you. You know, Martin Luther King Jr., when he wrote his famous Birmingham letter from jail, he quotes Aquinas about conscience and about justice. So, and I have that in there, needless to say. Very important that King learned something from, from Aquinas about social justice. And we all can learn from that.
Yeah, definitely. One of our traditions here at the Forum is we take questions on note cards, and Rebecca collects the questions and then brings them up for me. You know, I keep thinking about this question, and this is what I've been dying to ask you is, you know, if Aquinas would appear in the 21st century and you had a chance to take him around for a week, what do you think his impressions of this all would be, and what would you want to show him after all these years? What do you?
That's a fun question. Maybe I'd invite him to go dolphin hunting with you, surfing with the dolphins. But I think he would be absolutely ecstatic, out of his mind with today's science.
Yeah, I do too.
With what we're learning about the cosmos, the universe today, he would just flip, because that was his absolute number one passion. In fact, in my big book, Sheer Joy in Aquinas, I have an appendix, which is his commentary on, I think it's Euclid's version of the planetary movement and all this. I don't understand it. It goes on for about 8 pages, and I don't pretend to understand it. But what's exciting about it to me is he's in there with the nitty-gritty, arguing with the scientists and showing what the scientists are saying, trying to
Sheer joy.
Trying to bring out, you know, the news about how the universe works. And so I think that's number one. I'd want him to go to a scientific setting and hear the new creation story. And he would just totally flip, because that was his absolute passion. And that's where he so sets himself off on fundamentalists, which in his day were the Augustinian too. Because Augustine says all his nature is fallen, so, you know, we don't have to worry about nature, we have to save our souls. Well, Aquinas totally turned his back on that. And that if a mistake about creation results in a mistake about God, wouldn't it be true that an insight about creation would result in an insight about God? Well, hey, why not hang around scientists, therefore? So that would be the number one thing. And frankly, I don't think you'd want to leave. I think you'd want to hang out with the scientists.
Observatory
but of course, you know, to learn the struggles we're undergoing regarding our own failures as a species, and now the price we're paying for that in terms of the eco-devastation, climate change and all that, that would be, of course, on his mind. I think he'd be very excited about ecumenism and interfaith. He says, for example, I have a chapter on this, he says, all truth, whoever utters it, comes from the Holy Spirit. All truth, whoever utters it, comes from the Holy Spirit. That means whether scientists utter it, or artists utter it, or filmmakers, or Muslims, Sufis, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. And he says, the pagans, he says, revelation was given to many pagans. Revelation was given to many pagans. And he may have Aristotle in mind there, among others.
I think he does.
But the point is, I think he would be thoroughly involved in the ecumenical movement of our time. The wisdom from Buddhism, the wisdom from Judaism, the wisdom from Islam and Sufism and indigenous people. I think he would be thrilled with that. A gift that we all drink in at this moment in history. And then, of course, I think he would be excited about the effort at democracy. He'd also be concerned about its demise currently. I think he'd need several more lifetimes, I think.
Oh, that's great. I love hearing your reflections on that. Here's a question, and this is a beautiful one. Blessings, Matthew. First, you are my hero. Decades ago, you brought me back to the church of my birth with your book, The Coming of the Cosmic Christ. Thank you for your vision, bravery, and compassion. I'm grateful forever. My question, how did you have the courage and strength to move with such grace through the era when you met with such rejection from the Vatican? That's a great question, huh?
Well, I had the privilege once of meeting Fred Shuttlesworth.
Oh, yes.
He worked with King in Birmingham. He was the number one black minister in Birmingham for the movement. His house was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan, and he was in it. He was beaten 3 times with chains by the Ku Klux Klan. His 2 children, 8 and 10 years old, were arrested by the sheriff and put in jail. And he invited me to come and do a dialogue with him on ecology and racism. This would have been 20 years ago. Now it's a prominent topic. Back then, he was an absolute pioneer. He was in his 80s at the time. So before we did this public dialogue, we were having lunch together, sharing a sandwich, and I said, I have one question for you, Fred. Where do you get your courage? And he said, well, you can call it courage, but I don't. He said, I call it trust. He said, when I walked out of my home, the roof had caved in, I was alive, I said to myself, they cannot kill me. They may kill my body, they cannot kill the movement. They cannot kill me. So to me, that was a tremendous insight, that courage and trust are the same thing. And trust is a real name for faith. We've been mistranslating the word pistuane from the New Testament for years as faith. It really means trust. Jesus says, go your way, your trust has made you whole. Your trust has saved you. So I think I had trust, that's all, in my vocation, and in the truth of what I was talking about, like original blessing.
Yeah.
Either believe it or you don't. And I was willing to go down for truth because, the motto of the Dominicans, and Aquinas was a Dominican, and I was, is veritas, truth. Now, they haven't always lived up to it because they have a shadow side too. Torquemada, the Inquisitor General, was a Dominican, I'm sorry to say. But so was Aquinas, and so was Eckhart, and so were wonderful people in the 20th century. So anyway, I trusted in the truth that I was discovering. And if it rattled a few gilded cages, that's their problem, not mine. So I believe in truth. And I think I got that strength from my parents, too, and especially my mother, that, she said, you got to stand up for what you think is true.
That's great. How has the new emphasis on quantum thinking changed your concept of the physics of angels? I was going to ask questions about this. And with regard to the cosmos of Aquinas, physics, the physics of angels is something that this person's interested in.
Well, of course, Rupert Sheldrake and I, the British scientist, wrote a book called The Physics of Angels. So I presume that relates to that book. There is a chapter here on Aquinas and angels. The sentence from Aquinas is, angels carry thoughts from prophets to prophet. I think that's a wonderful image. I get the image of a bee carrying nectar from flower to flower. But Aquinas has a lot to say about angels, and in our book on the physics of angels, there's a whole section on Aquinas' teaching. And one thing he says is that angels cannot help but love, and that they're these supremely intelligent beings, but they learn only through intuition. They don't have to go to school or write books or read them or anything. Intuition is their thing. So as we develop our intuition, we will run into angels. They're hitchhiking on that highway of intuition. That's how I put it. And of course, we know this because we even have it in our language, the word muse. The word muse is about a spirit or an angel that accompanies you in creative moments. You get the word musician, the word museum, and so forth. So angels are very attuned to creativity. They want to be part of the creative process. And Lorna Byrne, when she was talking to us upstairs about angels, one of the points she made was she said, there are a lot of unemployed angels in the world today. And this was several years ago when we were still recovering from the economic crash. Oh my God, I said, I know a lot of unemployed people. Are you telling me we have to put angels to work too? Well, she said, this is the deal. She said, God knows how much trouble humans are in today. So God is pouring angels on the earth to help us, and no one's asking them for help.
Right.
So there's a lot of unemployed angels in the world today.
Walking the streets of Washington, D.C.
And San Francisco.
San Francisco and San Jose.
There you go, walking the streets. And so we should invoke them. Go to bed tonight and call for an angel. And have a pencil and paper next to your bed, because they don't respect our need for sleep. They don't get it. So they'll wake you up at 3 a.m. with ideas. You jot it down, then go get your sleep. Go back to sleep. But many artists know this. I've talked to many musicians and painters and others who have told me they've had visitations from angels. I know one artist who lives here in San Francisco who says he locks his door often when he's painting because angels come through the canvas and tell him what to do. And he talks back to them, and he locks the door because he doesn't want anyone thinking he's
there's
crazy.
Definitely a feeling that we have that something comes out of us that we just didn't know was in there. Do you know what I mean?
A presence.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, here's another question. You are very informed and wise. Do you live what you know to be true? If not, what are you working on? That is a good one.
Well, I don't know if I'll agree with the first sentence, but I do try to live. Yeah, I try to preach what's the word? Preach?
Practice what you
Practice
preach.
what I preach, or walk my talk. Of course I do. That's why I get in trouble. And more trouble. I try, yeah.
And so the second part of the part is what are you working on?
Oh, what am I working on? Well, let's see. Well, we're working on trying to launch a new online certificate program, increasing spirituality.
They want 3 spiritual sins and 3, what were the physical, what are the other 3 spiritual sins and 3 physical sins. That's what no, I think
they want me to go to confession? Is that what they want?
That is. But I think it's more like what's happening just kind of in your.
Well, part of working on myself now is I'm entering my 80th year. I'll be 80 in December. So that's kind of old.
Yeah.
I never felt 70s were old, but 80 just strikes me as kind of old. On the other hand, I have a brother who's 83, and he's learning Icelandic for the first time.
Wow.
He's married to an Icelandic woman, but they moved from Chicago to Iceland when he retired.
Wow.
And I'm proud of that. I said, wow, Icelandic is not the easiest language to learn. So if he can do that, I guess I can continue to stumble along with theology. But learning how to survive, you know. When the Dominicans kick you out after 34 years, you don't get any pension or anything like that. And
that's what I'm most
or even Social Security, because all those years with avowed poverty, you've been working, and no money has gone into Social Security.
Yeah.
So just survival is an issue. I don't want to have to depend on others.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, and then the daily news. Oh my goodness! I mean, we're all working on that, aren't we?
Yeah.
I started this thing on Mother's Day called Daily Meditations. I invite you to go there. It's free. Every morning I do a meditation, and called Daily Meditations with MatthewFox.org. Just go there. It's free. But so working on that is a challenge. But I like it, and because it keeps me alert, and I'm communicating with people, and it's a circle. People give me ideas and all that, and it's a simple way of giving away, some of my learnings,
right? Exactly.
Whatever wisdom might be there. So
here's the next step.
Tending to keep me going.
Yeah, for sure. What step can be taken to spread love and joy in this dark climate in which we inhabit?
Well, to me, that relates exactly to the last point I was making.
Yeah.
How do we stay hopeful and alive and not succumb to the anxiety of our time?
Yeah.
And we all have to wrestle with that. I call it how to learn to pray the news. To pray the news, not just watch it. And because sometimes it's just so bad.
Yeah.
And so you have to, I think, kind of fast sometimes from the news, especially in Lent maybe, do some fasting from the news, and work on the joy part.
Right.
We have to find the joy and the goodness. And of course, friendship helps with that. But many friends are dead. So that's why I like Aquinas. My whole life I've been looking for allies and friends, some of
Yes.
whom have been dead for centuries, like Meister Eckhart or Hildegard of Bingen
Those
or
are the three I think
Aquinas.
of when I think of you. Like if I think of, like, if we're to have a little Matthew Fox Chapel, those three images are the ones that we'd have in there.
Well,
And yeah,
I'm
you
glad.
still work
Those-
with them, and they're still
Those
with
are
you.
the three. Yeah, that's what I find when I look back on my life and my writings. Usually I write a book that's contemporary, then I go back to the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
then a contemporary, then back. And I realize now why I did that I get filled up by the pre-modern consciousness, the modern consciousness, and we're dealing now with the leftovers of that. We're paying the piper now
Right.
for modern consciousness that was so anthropocentric. Yes, it did good things. It gave us science and got us to the moon and back, and got us electricity, but we paid a hell of a price for it, and other species have paid a hell of a price for it. So that's why I find that going to pre-modern consciousness, and then also I've been very blessed by Native American practices, sweat lodges, sun dances, vision quests, and just friendships. I think the pre-modern people have so much to teach us,
Yeah, I really
postmodern
do think so.
people.
I really agree. Okay, Hillary, Amy, Elizabeth on Susan B. Anthony's 200th birthday remain confined from prominence. Women leaders, that women leaders command. Yes, duality of gender is a problem. Do you have any encouragement for women and the women's movement?
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure they need my encouragement. I think so much has happened in my lifetime thanks to the women's movement. And it's one of the great signs of hope of our time. Obviously, it still has a long way to go in our culture and many other cultures, but it's not going to turn back. It's not going back into the toothpaste bottle. No, the recovery of the goddess, the divine feminine, is so essential to bring back this balance of healthy gender, masculine and feminine. Now, accompanying the feminist movement must be a male movement and that's why I wrote my book on the sacred masculine, the hidden spirituality of men, 10 metaphors to awaken the sacred masculine. Because when the goddess is back, she deserves a worthy consort. But so much of masculinity today around the world is distorted, it's toxic. And we've identified the masculine with the reptilian brain, meaning I win, you lose. It's all about that kind of competition. And that's not healthy masculinity. So I lay out these 10 archetypes like Father Sky, Green Man, Blue Man, Hunter-Gatherer, Spiritual Warrior, all these masculine energies that should be part of healthy women as well as healthy men. Just like the goddess is not just about women. Every man wants to open up to the divine feminine too and find the energies there that are more identified with the feminine. And even God talk. We have to get back to a balance of the masculine and the feminine in our imagery about divinity too.
Yeah, that's really true.
Yeah.
Would you address the inheritance of St. Thomas? How did he become ossified as the founder of scholasticism, the quote-unquote founder of scholasticism?
Well, pray that they never canonize you. Do things in your life to make sure they never canonize you, because it doesn't always work out well. But that's a really good question. That he was used as a orthodox cudgel to beat people up with, and that was, of course, the narrow version of Thomism. I point out in the introduction, it's time to rescue Aquinas from Thomism, Jesus from Christianity, and St. Francis from the bird bath. We're living that. That's why the subtitle of the book is Fierce Wisdom for Hard Times. We're living in hard times, and we need the substance of a person like Aquinas. That's what we need. Activists need someone of that substance. But to get to him, you have to be willing to throw out Thomism. Just like to get at Jesus, you sometimes have to be willing to throw out a lot of Christianity. And to get at Francis, to throw out the bird bath, sentimentalizing of him. Francis was one tough dude. And he was smart. Do you know when he did not, his order that he started, he did not want his brothers to be priests because he knew he was so smart. He watched priests. And he watched what hierarchy does to priests, how you can easily sell your soul as you climb the ladder. So he insists, brothers only, brothers only. But his order was so successful, within a couple of years there were 4,500 Franciscans that the Vatican said, oh boy, here's something we can use. And they wanted him to have his brother's be ordained. He said no. So they took his order away from him. 2 years later, he died. I think he died of a broken heart. Within a generation, Franciscans were running the Inquisition. The same happened with the Dominicans. But you see, Francis knew he was one smart dude. He had it figured out how power works, And so we have to learn these lessons that people like Francis, we cannot afford to sentimentalize them. Same with Aquinas. And just making him into this scholastic binary, truth, falsehood. No, he was an absolute curious scientist. And that's why when I did my work on Aquinas, first my big book, Sheer Joy, and then here, I translated all his works that had never been in English before, or German, or French, or even Italian. And these are his biblical commentaries, most of them, which are not scholastic. They're much less, his mind is much freer in roaming through the scriptures and so forth. His commentaries on Lamentations, on Job, on Ezekiel, on Jeremiah, and Isaiah, and so forth. Wonderful stuff. And that stuff is left out by all these people who want to make an orthodox cudgel out of him.
Yeah, we just never hear about it.
Yeah. But remember, too, the scholasticism was a very radical new thing from Islam in Aquinas' day. It overturned the entire educational system of the patristic inheritance, because all that was about quoting authors from the past, dead people, and just citing them. Whereas scholasticism opened the door to science, because scholasticism was essentially about prove it.
Right.
Prove it to me. It was about logic and proof.
Well, empiricism.
And empiricism, absolutely. And the real historians of science will acknowledge that. The scholasticism was a first step to science. Then, of course, it got frozen and rigid, and when religion got that way.
That's what we see too.
And that's what we remember it as.
It's been such a pleasure having you. I hate to stop because I still have like another 17 questions for you.
Well, I love your questions.
But I guess
they're
the
very
last
creative.
question I would have, just to kind of close things up, we started off talking about younger people. I'm talking about you as a young person, your recollections and the courageous decisions you made that put you on this path. Like, what advice would you give to young people now in this time of tension and conflict and pessimism?
Pick up Aquinas.
All right, that's
I mean
great.
it. I mean it. That's why I wrote this book. There's a beautiful sentence right in the front of the book from Gwen. He says, what does he say? Wisdom, I'm going to get it right.
I underlined everything in there, so if you can find anything.
There it is. Wisdom is able to direct us not only in contemplation, but also in action. Not only in contemplation, but also in action. And remember that wisdom is feminine. She's feminine in the Bible, Chokmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Greek, and she's also feminine around the world. So that's part of every young person's world today, is bringing in, seek wisdom, not just knowledge. Knowledge can be stored in a computer. Wisdom is something deeper. We've increased in knowledge like this, but in wisdom, we have not grown that much. So draw on the wise figures, our ancestors, who are knocking on our hearts because they want to help us today. And Aquinas is one of the absolute greatest of them in the West, without question. So, that's why I wrote the book for young people.
And the angels helped.
And the angels helped, I hope. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I'm so grateful for you coming.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Next week, we're going to be having as our guest Dr. Hatem Bazian, the co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. We'll be talking about Palestine, Palestinians, and Islam. You're welcome to stay for Choral Eucharist upstairs afterwards. We also would be delighted if we could have your support on your way out. We need your financial support too. And Matthew will be signing books and selling books, and he's got other books other than just the Tao of Thomas, and so there's plenty of new things to discover and explore. But thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful that you made time for this.
Well, thank you for making time for me.